crazy enough. If I think back now, I was 14 years old, going on 15, and I thought the world would come to an end now because God was dead.
They built illusions. Every wall, every sign, every word, a trap. The weak thought they walked towards safety, while the sick towards mercy. While hope was a mere bait, death was certain, and inside those gates, trust itself became the executioner. What lay beyond were traps, far darker than nightmares. This is what the most horrific traps inside the Nazi camps looked like.
But I don't know if I knew what death was. I knew it's a place you don't come back from. But I didn't know what exactly the adult women knew. So they were like screaming and crying and so forth. So I remember that very well.
The door closed with a soft metallic click, too gentle, almost polite. That sound was the last kindness anyone inside would ever hear. The prisoners had been told they were going to be disinfected, washed, given relief after the filth of travel and labor. The room looked harmless enough, some of its walls tiled, rows of showerheads above, some even sighed with fragile hope. At last clean water, or so they thought. But the illusion was the weapon. The guards stood outside with their stopwatches, masks of boredom hiding the cruelty underneath. Inside, the prisoners shuffled together, children clinging to mothers, men whispering promises they could not keep. Then came the hiss, a faint, serpentine whisper from the ceiling. Instead of water, a pale cloud began to spread. A metallic sting on the tongue, a thin chemical bite in the air, each breath dragging poison deeper into their lungs without end. It filled lungs before minds could comprehend, chests convulsed. Fingers clawed at doors, at walls, at their own throats. Eyes bulged in terror as the truth unraveled. They were graves disguised as plumbing. Screams tore against walls. Some scrambled for air, others sank, convulsing. The cruelty was doubled by the lie. To the guards, this was efficiency, killing made clean, wrapped in deception. To the prisoners, it was betrayal so profound it shattered the final thread of trust in humanity. The gas didn't just suffocate their lungs, it suffocated the very concept of safety, of truth, of mercy. And when the screaming stopped, silence carried more weight than the stone walls themselves. The doors swung open, not to rescue, but to dispose. Bodies were dragged, stacked, burned, resetting the chamber for the following day. The gas chamber wasn't simply a machine of death, it was a theater of cruelty. Hope was the bait, air was the weapon, deception the blade. But what came next made even this cruelty look honest in comparison. A tent stood at the edge of the camp, its canvas white, its entrance marked with a red cross. To the starving and broken, it looked like salvation, a place where wounds might be treated, where the sick could finally rest. For prisoners too weak to walk another step, it was the only glimpse of hope they were offered. But hope, here, was a noose. The field hospital was never medicine, it was a theater. Inside, there were no doctors, only executioners with rifles and syringes. Prisoners were led in carefully, as if they mattered, as if relief awaited them, and for a moment, they believed it. For a moment, they unclenched their fists and breathed, unaware that the pit waited just steps away. Then the deception snapped shut. Behind the tent, a pit waited, raw earth carved into a grave too large for a single body. The sick and wounded were marched through like cattle, lined against the edge, and shot one after the other. Their last sight was not a healer's face, but the endless dirt yawning to swallow them. In certain camps, this nightmare was routine. The Red Cross emblem, a universal symbol of mercy, was perverted into bait. The Nazis knew that even the desperate still longed for care. They twisted that longing, turned it against the very people who clung to it. The hospital wasn't a place of recovery, it was a conveyor belt into the earth. Guards spoke softly at first, telling prisoners to rest, to step inside, to wait their turn. Then the crack of rifles shattered the lie, echoing across the pit like thunder. Bodies fell in heaps. Sometimes they were not yet dead when the dirt began to cover them, shallow breaths silenced by shovelfuls of soil. It wasn't only the killing that horrified, it was the betrayal. To be sick, to be dying, and to believe, even for a moment, that someone might save you, only to realize the hospital was designed to finish what the disease began. That knowledge crushed the soul long before the bullet pierced the skull. The fake field hospital wasn't built to heal. It was built to mock the very idea of healing. It taught the prisoners that nowhere was safe, that even kindness was a camouflage, that every path led only one way, into the pit. Nonetheless, the next trick carved this betrayal even deeper, wearing the mask of mercy itself. The trucks arrived with symbols of mercy painted on their sides. Bold red crosses gleamed against white panels, international signs of safety, recognized across the world. To the prisoners, the sight sparked something dangerously close to relief. The sick, the elderly, the children, surely these vehicles meant evacuation, medical care, maybe even rescue. But in the camps, symbols didn't save, they slaughtered. The prisoners were gathered gently, almost respectfully. Mothers clutching feverish children, the frail leaning on stronger arms. They were guided into the trucks by guards who didn't bark, didn't shove, but coaxed, soft words, kind gestures. For the first time in weeks, the condemned weren't treated like animals. They were treated like patients. And that was the trap. The engines roared to life, rolling past barbed wire, guard towers, and watchful rifles, faces pressed against slats, eyes filling with trembling hope that would soon be extinguished. They whispered to one another, maybe a hospital, maybe a clinic, maybe freedom. Instead, the trucks stopped at the chambers, the same chambers where screams had been swallowed whole, where the hiss of poison gas replaced every prayer. The children were the first unloaded, their mothers next. The elderly shuffled last. The lie was absolute. The prisoners had been collected like fragile packages, wrapped in false care, only to be delivered straight into death. The Red Cross became a dagger, stabbing at the very idea of trust. Even worse, the guards used the deception again and again. Each truckload carried away innocence, faith, and the faint idea that the outside world might intervene. Those left behind watched the trucks depart and return empty, their painted symbols still gleaming, their engines still humming. They learned quickly what mercy meant in this place. Mercy was a mask stretched over a furnace. The Red Cross was supposed to shield the vulnerable. Here, it was bait to slaughter them first. For those inside, the trucks became a verdict. No emblem, promise, or symbol on earth could protect them. The lie was absolute. The Red Cross became a danger. Every sign of safety was poisoned, every banner of help corrupted. And once trust itself was destroyed, the next trap struck where it hurt most, at the children. Children were gathered first. Their hands too small for labor, their bodies too fragile for stone or shovel. The guards spoke of safety, of a special place where the little ones would be protected. Parents clung to the promise. For once, something human was offered inside the camp. The huts looked different from the rest. Painted walls, neatly arranged bunks, even crude drawings on the boards, as if someone had tried to imitate a school or a dormitory. Mothers whispered to themselves, perhaps the children will be spared. Perhaps they will live. But these barracks were not shelters. They were waiting rooms for the gas. The charade was meticulous. Children were led in with songs, sometimes even given toys scavenged from those who had already been killed. Guards told them stories, smiling as they spoke, hiding the truth that each bed was a cradle of death. Parents were torn apart inside. Some clung to the lie, convincing themselves that separation was temporary, that the children would be cared for until families were reunited. Others, with trembling hands, whispered prayers. They knew but dared not voice the truth aloud, for fear of breaking what little spirit remained. The Kinderbarracks were designed for that silence. They turned the natural instinct to protect into a knife. Mothers surrendered their children not because they wanted to, but because the mockery promised survival. So, when the time came, the children were moved swiftly to the chambers, ahead of the adults, ahead of the strong. They were always among the first to die. The cruelty was not only in the killing, it was in the charade. By decorating the huts, by filling them with false warmth, the Nazis twisted hope into a weapon. They mocked innocence, turned it into bait, and used parents' love against them. The Kinderbarracks were not just a trap, they were the destruction of everything sacred. Childhood, safety, family, all inverted, all corrupted. The sight of those painted walls became a memory that haunted survivors forever, a picture of safety that concealed nothing but ash. Still, the deception grew darker when medicine itself became the trap. The sick dragged themselves toward the building with a faint spark of hope. The sign said, "Hospital." The guards pointed them inside. For prisoners whose bodies were breaking from starvation and disease, it seemed like the last refuge left. A place to clean wounds, to lower fevers. But the hospital was not a place for healing. It was a slaughterhouse with beds. Inside, there were no real doctors. White coats, yes. Needles, yes. But their purpose was not treatment. It was experimentation. Prisoners were strapped down. Chemicals burned through their veins. Diseases were injected deliberately to watch the agony unfold. The lucky ones were given injections of phenol straight into the heart. Quick, efficient, dead within seconds. The unlucky became test subjects. Their bodies were carved open in search of knowledge that no one had asked for. Bones broken, organs removed, wounds left festering. Research was the word used. Torture was the reality. The deception made it worse. Patients entered with trust. They whispered prayers that someone might ease their pain. Instead, they were met with cold hands, sharp steel, and a gaze that saw them not as human, but as material. A cough meant you were marked. A fever meant you were chosen. And once you entered the block, you never came out alive. The hospital blocks were designed to break the spirit of the camp itself. They robbed the weak of any final chance at comfort. To go to a healer and find only death was the ultimate betrayal. It taught every prisoner that there was no safety left, not in work, not in prayer, not in medicine. The walls of those wards held screams that never ended, sometimes silence. Silence that told others waiting outside exactly what had happened within. The hospital did not cure disease, it spread only despair. And after medicine was weaponized, the next trap turned survival itself into bait. If this story has gripped you so far, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell because the next sections will take you even deeper into the darkest deceptions history has ever witnessed. Hunger ruled everything. It twisted the body, hollowed the eyes, and scraped the soul down to instinct. Prisoners would do anything for a scrap, anything for the chance to quiet the gnawing pain that never left their stomachs. The guards knew this. Despite knowing, they turned hunger into a snare. At the edge of the camp stood the death strip, a stretch of open ground in front of the electrified fence. Guards would toss bread crusts or potatoes into the strip, just close enough to tempt, just far enough to be dangerous. The starving stared at the food like drowning men gasping for air. Some resisted. Stomachs screamed louder than reason. And then the rifles cracked. The moment a prisoner bent down to grab the food, gunfire ripped through the silence. Bodies collapsed into the dirt, their blood soaking the bread they had reached for. The guards laughed. To them, it was sport. To the rest of the prisoners watching, it was torture beyond comprehension. The trap was never about food. It was about stripping away dignity, about forcing men, women, even children to choose between starvation and execution, about making them complicit in their own deaths. Some prisoners tried to resist, refusing to move no matter how desperate their need. But seeing another risk it and die only carved the lesson deeper. Hunger could kill you two ways: slowly inside your stomach, or instantly at the fence. The bread wasn't just bait, it was humiliation baked into crusts. It showed that the Nazis could twist even the simplest human need into entertainment. The food desperation at the fence was a message written in gunfire. Survival itself was forbidden. The gunfire stopped. The silence didn't waken, and in that silence, something far worse was waiting. The quarry was carved deep into the earth, a jagged scar that swallowed men whole. At its center stood the stairway, 186 steps, cut from stone, stacked uneven, steep as a wall, and stretching upward like an executioner's arm. The prisoners called it the Stairway of Death. Some had already learned that there was only one way to escape it, not by reaching the top, but by leaping from it. Every morning, they were marched to its base, boulders shoved into skeletal arms, massive slabs of granite, sometimes weighing more than the men themselves. The command was simple: climb. Step after step, stone pressing bone to dust. The first steps stole breath. The middle steps broke the spine. The top steps shattered what little hope remained. Starved bodies trembled, legs buckled under impossible weight. One slip was enough to unleash disaster. A single stone would tumble backward, smashing into those behind. The staircase turned into a chain of destruction, screams, cracking bones, skulls splitting against rock. The guards didn't look away. They roared with laughter. They cheered the collapse as if it were a spectacle. Sometimes they didn't wait for accidents. They kicked boulders loose deliberately, watching them thunder down into the crowd of men below, crushing life with every strike. But the true cruelty wasn't only in the falling stones. It was in the climb itself. No matter how strong a prisoner was, no matter how determined, the staircase always won. The stronger you fought, the heavier the burden became. Reaching the top brought no reward. There was no rest, no water, no reprieve. At the summit, they were forced to drag their stone back down, only to climb again. It wasn't work. It was ritualized destruction. The guards knew the climb would kill slowly, piece by piece, and that was the point. Some men broke differently. Their minds snapped before their bodies did. They raced to the summit, not to deliver stone, but to leap. To hurl themselves into the abyss below. The plunge was final, and in those moments of despair, the guards laughed harder. Even suicide became their entertainment. The staircase didn't just break bodies, it broke souls. Each morning, prisoners woke with the weight of the steps already pressing down on them. The quarry became a place where men prayed not for survival, but for an end. The steps didn't stop killing when the day ended. At night, men dreamed of falling, dreamed of stones crushing their ribs, dreamed of the laughter echoing down from above. The staircase haunted them even in their sleep. It was never about granite, never about construction. It was about annihilation disguised as labor. The Nazis turned gravity itself into an executioner, stone into shackles, and exhaustion into a weapon. The stairway of death was not a path upward, it was a slow descent into the grave. And when the quarry grew silent, when the last rock had crashed and the dust had settled, the echoes of laughter still clung to the air like smoke. There was no way up, there was only down. And beyond these, something even more brutal awaited.
And I remember saying to my mom, I'm going to be killed by them. And she said, no, they trained only to kill if you run, and you're not going to run.
At dawn, the gates opened. A sharp wind swept across the camp, carrying with it the scent of wet soil and grass. For a fleeting moment, the prisoners thought the nightmare had loosened. The guards stood in rows, dogs barking with foaming mouths, straining against their chains, rifles glinting, a warning they couldn't yet grasp. Then came the order, run. The hare hunts had begun. It was presented as a chance, an escape. a breath of freedom in a world built from chains. Gaunt men and women hesitated only for a heartbeat before surging forward, stumbling into the fields beyond. For the first time in months, the horizon stretched open before them. Their feet struck the earth, their lungs filled with the taste of freedom. For a heartbeat, hope returned. But the guards followed, and the dogs were faster. The first shots cracked the air, sharp and merciless. Prisoners folded into the grass, their bodies collapsing mid-stride. Blood splashed into the soil. It drowned the very footsteps still warm from seconds before. Dogs pounced on others, dragging them down with snarls and teeth before the rifles finished the job. The hunt was not execution, it was entertainment. Guards laughed as they fired. They shouted wages. They released the dogs as if they were unleashing sport hounds on a fox. Every life ended was applause, every scream a prize. And the cruelty stretched further. Those left behind were forced to watch, forced to see freedom dangled and snatched away, forced to hear the gunfire echo across the fields, the laughter that followed each shot. For them, the hunts killed something deeper than the body. They killed hope itself. Some prisoners refused to run, sensing the trap, but refusal was no shield. Guards shoved them forward, kicked them into the open, and made them pray anyway. There was no choice. Run or die. The hare hunts destroyed more than the flesh. They rewired the mind. To run became dangerous. To dream became poison. The very thought of escape turned into a curse. The camp was no longer just barbed wire and stone, it was a cage of the spirit. Every hunt was a lesson. The lesson was simple. Freedom is death. At the end of each hunt, silence spread across the fields. The laughter faded, the rifles quieted, but the soil stayed red. And the survivors carried the image like a brand. They had watched friends, brothers, fathers, mothers sprint into freedom, only to be hunted down like animals. The gates closed again. The guards returned with dogs panting and rifles still warm. Inside the camp, the message remained etched in every prisoner's mind. There was no escape. Not through strength, not through speed, not through hope. The hare hunts were not just cruelty. They were the final mockery, a glimpse of freedom, only to remind you that freedom itself was forbidden. The prisoners had been given permission to run, but it was only permission to die. These were not camps. They were traps, each more vicious than the last. Which one struck you the hardest? Comment below, because silence is the one thing these horrors must never claim.